After years of relative stability thanks to Russian peacekeeping forces, last week Azerbaijan launched a military takeover of the contested Nagorno-Karabakh region, expelling the mostly Armenian population that lived there and inflaming a conflict that goes back centuries. Hello, and welcome to the Modern Context podcast. I'm your host, Yasmin Aliyah Khan, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you're new to the podcast, thanks so much for checking it out. Happy to have you, and if it's not your first time, thanks for coming back. So in the last episode, we talked a lot about death, because, as I mentioned in the episode, I think about death a lot. But I think a lot more people are starting to think about death too, and not just death specifically or on its own. I mean, as a society, we seem to be in a constant collective state of existential dread, with our own looming, self-inflicted extinction seemingly just around the corner. If it's not the climate crisis that'll get us, it's the nukes. If it's not the nukes, then I don't know, maybe the aliens will finally come for us. But even without mass extinction, societal collapse feels inevitable sometimes, with everything from AI and possibly sentient robots threatening our livelihoods and our ability to earn a living, to social media, eroding the brains and attention spans of our youngest generation, which has never known life without an iPad, to the economic crisis robbing us of our right to own property and our right to not work eventually. Things feel grim, so naturally, it's got some people thinking about legacies. Our personal legacies, yeah, but also our legacy as a civilization, as a people who lived during a time. Anyway, so we explored that a bit in episode 3, so if you missed it, be sure to check it out. But speaking of nukes, I think I mentioned nukes somewhere in that existentialist bit. War is sadly one of those reliable and constant things in our human experience. Even during so-called peace times, there are always smaller-scale wars happening around the globe. And by smaller scale, I don't mean that they're any less devastating or deadly for the people fighting them or for the victims who just want to live their lives with some semblance of stability. I just mean that they don't get the constant news coverage, and in many cases, many people probably aren't even aware that they're happening. And you can't blame them. There's a lot to keep track of, and for the news organizations to report on these international stories, they'd realistically have to give quite a bit of background to get their audience to a point of understanding and then to a point of caring. There are a lot of factors that contribute to any given conflict around the globe. There's demographics and religion, which usually play a part. Then there's socioeconomic issues sometimes. There are historic grudges that can go back centuries. And then there are larger and more opportunistic players backing the smaller parties, turning these so-called small-scaled conflicts into much larger and much more globally significant proxy wars, and more. And in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, you get all of that. Last week, Azerbaijan reclaimed the Nagorno-Karabakh region. The region had long been contested, but while the land technically belonged to Azerbaijan, the majority of its population, at least as of a week ago, was Armenian. Now, on the surface, that doesn't sound like much of a contest, but trust me, it's more complicated than that. For the past couple of years, things had been relatively quiet over there. The Russians were peacekeeping over there, but, well, it would seem the Russians have been a bit distracted lately. Azerbaijan decided it had had enough of the peace, so when the Russians weren't looking, it finally made its move. For anyone paying attention, this was only a matter of time. After all, a peacekeeping force in a region just means that no one is making any moves right now. It doesn't mean that tensions are eased, nor does it mean that disputes are resolved. To understand this conflict, you have to understand the geography of these two countries. Really, I promise, it matters and it helps to make more sense of everything. Geopolitics is a thing for a reason. The geography informs the land, the people, the borders, and so much more. I realize that discussing geography in the way I'm about to isn't ideal in a podcast format, but I will do my best to paint you a picture. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm sorry, but it's not much better over here. One day, I'm sure we will have visuals to go with everything I'm saying, but it is not this day. This day, we just listen. All right, so we are dealing with two countries that are deeply interconnected with each other. They're almost impossible to separate from one another because they sort of exist within each other. You'll see what I mean. Let's take Armenia first. Armenia is a landlocked nation located within the Lesser Caucasus Mountains. It sits directly above the Middle East, and Russia is not too far north of it. It's bordered by Georgia to the north, Iran to the south, Turkey to the west, Azerbaijan to the southwest, and to the east is Azerbaijan again. Yes, Armenia is flanked on both sides on the east and west by Azerbaijan. Between Iran and Armenia, there is a small, landlocked exclave of Azerbaijan called Nakhchivan. It's completely separate from the rest of the country, so on a map, Armenia looks like it's splitting Azerbaijan in two. Bit of a side note, it's not really understood why this region belongs to Azerbaijan. Apparently, it was supposed to go to Armenia, which would have made sense, but Stalin changed his mind at the last minute and just gave it to Azerbaijan. The people of Armenia are ethnically Armenian. They're their own thing. They're not Russian, Persian, Turk, whatever. They're just Armenian. And the Armenians have a rich history and culture of their own, including their own church, language, and alphabet. Today, the majority of Armenians are Christian. And speaking of its history goes back, way back, like cradle of civilization back. Remember, it's just north of the Middle East, and it's even rumored to have been the place where Noah's Ark washed up after the flood, which is fun. But the fact that Armenia is landlocked is significant. It's got the mountains running through it, which have helped and hindered the Armenian people throughout its history in terms of defensive and offensive obstacles. But without the hard edges you get with maybe a sea or an ocean border, landlocked borders are somewhat flexible. They're changeable, and that's certainly been true for Armenia over the centuries. Given its location, the land of modern-day Armenia very much exists in an in-between land. It's truly a land of intersectionality. Because of this, the land and the Armenian people have passed between several different major empires as they each pursued expansion. The struggle for control of this region goes all the way back to the Hittites of ancient Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, and later the Roman Empire in modern-day Turkey, the Assyrians in the modern-day Middle East, the Parthian Iranians, the Muslim caliphates, the Mongols, the Iranians again, the Ottoman Turks, and of course, the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union. So we already know that Azerbaijan sits mainly to the east of Armenia, apart from that small exclave that is on the other side of Armenia. But Azerbaijan has a pretty significant advantage over Armenia geographically. It's bordered by the Caspian Sea to the east. While it's always ideal to have access to a large body of water, this particular water is advantageous because offshore it's got oil. Azerbaijan has oil and lots of it. Armenia does not. However, to its north and south, Azerbaijan has somewhat hostile enemies. Directly to its north is Russia, and to its south is Iran. Russia is technically allied with Armenia, though they're not totally unfriendly with Azerbaijan. They play both sides a little bit. Iran and Azerbaijan have their own issues, which is sort of separate from the rest of this. Sort of, everything's all connected, honestly, but real quick, both Azerbaijan and Iran have high populations of Shia Muslims, and because of this, a bunch of Azeris live in northern Iran. In fact, more Azeris live in Iran than the whole population of Azerbaijan, so sometimes there's talk of an Azeri separatist movement in Iran. No big deal. Azerbaijan also borders Georgia to the northeast, and notably, that small exclave Nakhchivan has a tiny land border with Turkey. These two borders are significant because Turkey is Azerbaijan's largest ally in the region, based primarily on the fact that many Azeris are ethnic Turks. They protect their own. One former Azeri president even referred to the relationship between the two as one nation, two states. Georgia, meanwhile, is friendly with Azerbaijan, which is important for the Azeri oil and gas trade. With a network of pipelines running from Azerbaijan through Georgia all the way to Turkey, Azeri oil and gas from the Caspian Sea can be distributed throughout Western Europe without having to contend with Armenia, Iran, or Russia. But speaking of Turkey, while they're supportive of their Azeri brethren, they have a much less amicable relationship with the Armenians, and that's putting it very, very lightly. Don't worry, I will not start you all the way back with the Hittites, but I will start you in the 1500s because I can't help myself. At this time, the Ottomans and the Persians had been fighting over this region for a while, so finally they split it in half. The western portion of the land went to the Ottomans, and the eastern portion went to the Persians. This kept up for a few centuries, but by the 1800s, following what would be the last of the Russo-Persian Wars, the formerly Persian Eastern Armenia suddenly found itself under Russian rule. Over on the Ottoman west side, the Christian Armenians were starting to feel oppressed under strict Muslim rule, but at this point, the Ottoman Empire was already in decline. Still, the empire wasn't going to just roll over and die. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had been weakened from its war with Russia. It was suffering economically from depression, rapidly losing land to other nations, and struggling to maintain a cultural and religious identity. At the same time, the Christian Armenians were getting restless, demanding better treatment and recognition within the empire. Rather than listening to their grievances and attempting a diplomatic solution to what came to be known as the Armenian question, the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II decided to quell any anti-Islamic or pro-Christian sentiment decisively. Instead of diplomacy, he villainized the Armenians, blaming them for all of the Ottomans' failures, and from 1894 to 1896, he massacred them. In what would come to be known as the Hamidian massacres or the Armenian massacres, death tolls are estimated to have been between 80,000 and 300,000 Armenians, with an estimated 50,000 children being made orphans. The massacres finally stopped in response to outrage from the international community, but this wouldn't be the worst the Armenians would suffer. The Armenians, by the way, weren't the only ones targeted during these massacres, as Hamid would later direct his wrath toward other Christian groups. Churches were either burned or converted to mosques. Christians left alive were forcibly converted to Islam. Christian villages and towns were burned down, and humanitarian crises inevitably followed, further exacerbating the death and devastation. But massacre is nothing compared to genocide. So quick disclaimer, this is a pretty controversial topic even today, so I will do my best to just give you the facts as I've seen them reported. Definitely, as always, explore this topic further on your own if you have questions about it or if you want to hear different perspectives on what we're about to talk about. All right, that said, let's talk about the Young Turks. With the Ottoman Empire's demise imminent, young, educated, and progressive youths saw an opportunity for reform. They recognized the time as a pivotal moment in history, with the old regime on its way out. A new system of government and society would have to replace it. For the most part, this movement arose in response to the Sultan reverting to authoritarian governance after previously agreeing to function within the constraints of a constitution. In 1908, in what came to be known as the Young Turk Revolution, a multi-party democracy emerged. By the way, it's important to understand that this revolution wasn't just about completely overthrowing or dismantling an empire. It was more anti-authoritarian, but it still sought to protect the Ottoman people, lands, and identity. But even the best intentions can become distorted. Once the Young Turks had enjoyed some success, the empire did eventually collapse, and within the power vacuum that followed, the leadership found itself without a plan to move forward. The progressives split into two parties, the Unionists and the Liberals. The Liberals were pro-Ottomanism, which was the opposite of nationalism, in that they sought to create a sense of cohesion and unity amongst the soon-to-be ex-Ottoman states, while also advocating for the autonomy and rights of ethnic minority groups. Furthermore, they believed in laissez-faire economics and a more decentralized government. Conversely, the Unionists were pro-nationalism and pro-social Darwinism, seeking to maintain the unity of the empire while ridding it of any that would threaten that unity. Just to put all of this into context for you, the Nazis, who were barely even a thing at the time, were also pro-nationalism and pro-social Darwinism. Unfortunately, the Liberals were soon silenced out of power by the Unionists, and by 1913, the Unionists had taken over control, creating a single-party state. For the Unionists, they wanted progress and modernization, and they wanted it fast. That meant they'd have to adopt more secular leadership and abandon Sharia law. However, over time, those goals came second to that of the Turkification of Anatolia, which was the idea that the empire should be run by a nationalistic Turkish majority, and all others who inherently posed a threat to that majority just by virtue of their otherness should be dealt with accordingly. During World War I, the Turks sided with the Germans, committing atrocities that would later be replicated by the Nazis during the Holocaust of World War II, large-scale ethnic cleansings of minorities, in this case, the Armenians and other Christian groups living within the borders of the empire. Anti-Christian sentiment had been brewing for years within the empire, though up to this point it had generally been directed towards non-Ottomans. That sentiment festered with time and propaganda, and the Ottoman defeat by Christians in the Balkan Wars didn't help. Leading up to the genocides, the Christian Armenians were singled out as potentially destabilizing factors against the Ottoman Empire to which they belonged. The now single-party Ottoman Empire, ruled by a select few called the Three Pashas, decided to do something about the Armenians, lest they side with the Christian Russians and attempt to dismantle the Ottomans from within. They rallied up ex-criminals and created a special organization, which they just called the Special Organization, to destroy the Armenians. They were raped and killed, often by being burned to death, and they were forcefully deported to very inhospitable areas where they weren't expected to survive, such as the Syrian desert and the sea. I mean, they loaded up literal boatloads of Armenians and tossed them overboard into the sea. They were gassed, lethally injected, and left to die from rampant disease in concentration camps. Their property was taken from them and redistributed to Turkish Muslims, and Armenians serving in the Ottoman army were disarmed and killed. Again, I want to emphasize that the Armenians were not the only targets of this special organization, but they were a major target. For example, the Greeks, while affected, were less affected than they would have otherwise been because the Ottomans' allies, the Germans, didn't want to upset the Greek government. To this day, the Turkish government does not recognize the genocide that took place during the war. Turkish children aren't taught about it in schools, and if they are, I'd imagine it's probably similar to the way American children are taught about what happened to the indigenous American tribes. Speaking of America, the U.S. government only recognized the Armenian genocide a few years ago in 2019 because up to that point they were trying to remain diplomatically friendly with Turkey. So, what reasons has the Turkish government given for its lack of acknowledgement? A few, and forgive my bias, they're kind of ridiculous. For one, Turkey claims that genocide was never its official mandate or goal, choosing to instead refer to it as justified deportations of perceived political enemies. Of course, as I mentioned, the deportations weren't exactly merciful or humane. This explanation fails to account for why the special organization was assembled specifically using violent criminals, And it doesn't explain why so much evidence of the alleged genocide was destroyed afterward. Okay, so maybe it's all just a matter of perspective. You call it genocide, they call it deportations. But another form of denial is that the modern nation of Turkey didn't even exist at the time. The Ottoman Empire did the genocides or the deportations. Why should Turkey be held responsible for something they technically didn't do? That's one hell of a loophole. Just change your name and say it wasn't you. But moving on, some argue that yes, the Armenian population did happen to decline significantly and rapidly over a short period of time. But Armenians also killed a lot of Turks during their time allied with the Russians. Still, that would have been an act of war amidst a conflict that had already been ongoing, which is distinguishable from the deliberate extermination of civilians belonging to a specific minority group. Also, comparing numbers, 60,000 Turks would have died at the hands of the Armenian-Russian alliance, while up to 1.5 million Armenians are estimated to have been targeted and killed by the Turks. And that's not even mentioning the ones who survived the pogrom only to be displaced from their homes or forced to marry and reproduce with Muslims. And speaking of numbers, some argue that the 1.5 million figure is inaccurate, so the whole thing must be a lie, and those who fall for it are falling for anti-Turk propaganda. Okay, last one, but it's a good one. Some argue that it's impossible for the Armenians to have suffered genocide because technically the term genocide wasn't coined until decades later. Literal semantics. Do what you want with that. Anyway, it's believed that because the Turks essentially got away with this bout of ethnic cleansing during World War I, the Nazis would attempt their own version of it just a few decades later without much fear of retribution. The Armenians, understandably, have never forgotten the atrocities of the massacre and then the genocide. For this reason, they are particularly on edge, being flanked and surrounded by both the Turks and the ethnically Turk Azeris. Speaking of ethnic Turks, how did they end up in Azerbaijan in the first place? Why are they separate from Turkey? The short answer is Joseph Stalin. The longer answer is that over the course of several centuries, the area was occupied by a few different empires. Specifically, during times of Ottoman rule, the Turkic people stretched out across the region to the banks of the Caspian Sea. Similarly, Iranian occupation probably influenced the large number of Shia Muslims living in the area. Additionally, once Stalin was in power, he was always fighting with the Turks. That southern tip of Russia borders Georgia, and there were a lot of Turks living in Georgia. Stalin wanted them out, so he forcibly deported them further west to the Stan countries of Central Asia. The deportation, of course, resulted in thousands of deaths, but once they were there, some of the formerly Georgian Turks started to clash with the locals, specifically in Uzbekistan, so many of them fled and resettled in Azerbaijan. But I mentioned Iranian occupation, so let's go back to that real quick. Prior to Stalin, the land had been under Iranian rule. However, during the Russo-Persian Wars, Iran lost part of the territory to the Russian Empire, leaving the people split between Russia and Iran. However, at this point, they didn't really have a national identity. They had always just been aligned with or controlled by a larger power. So by the early 1900s, we had some Azeri Turks living within the Russian Empire, which was interesting because the Turks and the Russians weren't exactly friends. The Russians at the time were actively trying to crumble the Ottoman Empire. So while they were now technically Russians, the Azeris sought to align themselves more with the Turks. They also struggled with identity a bit. They were Muslims living in a Christian empire, and they sought to emulate Western civilization while geographically being pretty far out east. They also became less religious and more secular, but they still wanted to maintain their Muslim identity as well as their place within the Muslim world. However, as Muslims in a Christian empire, they were treated as second-class citizens by, yes, the Russians, but also by the Christian Armenians. In this new normal, the Christian Armenians and the Russians became more wealthy and politically influential in the region. Inequality became such a problem that many Azeris grew to resent and even fear the Armenians. But then the Russian Empire collapsed, about a decade after the collapse of the Ottomans. Immediately after, in 1918, Azerbaijan was briefly declared independent, but there was still a lot of Armenians in the area. Armenians still controlled the capital city of Baku, which, by the way, is way out east bordering the Caspian Sea, and they wanted to keep it. The Azeris were able to take back the capital city with help from Turkey. Later, indebted to the Turks for their help, the Azeris would assist the Turks in some of their more heinous acts against the Armenians. So, the main disputed area in this entire conflict is the Nagorno-Karabakh region. It is located in Azerbaijan, but its population is made up primarily of Armenians. The Armenians don't want to leave because they have a historical claim to the land, but the Azeris want the Armenians off of their land. So why the dispute in the first place? Well, just a few years after the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Russians were back but rebranded. The entire region had come under Soviet rule, so when the Soviets redrew the borders between the two countries, they made Nagorno-Karabakh a semi-autonomous region in Azerbaijan, presumably to just not deal with the island of Armenians in the middle of the territory. But suddenly, a land dispute between these two briefly independent countries wasn't as big of a deal anymore. If they were all Soviets now, it made less of a difference which Soviets they were. Besides, neither the Armenians nor the Azeris were in control anymore. So if we skip ahead a few decades to the 1980s, just prior to the collapse of the USSR, the tensions between the two groups, while they had been quelled, had never really gone away. As each group became more and more nationalistic, the intermingling of citizenry became more and more unacceptable. Once the USSR finally collapsed in 1991, old tensions predictably flared up all over again. The Nagorno-Karabakh region was still mostly occupied by Armenians. Think of it like an island of Armenians living within Azerbaijan, but there was one town on that island that had a large Azeri population, Kajali. Kajali was strategically significant, so the Armenians wanted to regain control over it. For instance, the only airport in Nagorno-Karabakh was in Kajali, so the Armenians needed access to it so they could maintain a connection with the Armenian mainland. At this point, the whole Nagorno-Karabakh region was being blockaded by the surrounding Azerbaijan, so the airport really was the Armenians' only lifeline. So the Armenians cut road access to Kajali, creating their own blockade around the Azeris who lived there. That winter, Kajali was shelled regularly, and finally what came to be known as the Kajali massacre occurred. Azeris were forced to flee Kajali as the Armenians moved to reclaim it for Nagorno-Karabakh, but even as the Azeris tried to make their way to Azerbaijan, they were shot at by the Armenians. The official death toll of the massacre, according to the government of Azerbaijan, was 613, but according to varying reports, anywhere from 200 to 1,000 are estimated to have died, either from being shot at or from freezing to death in the mountains while trying to escape. In this conflict, Armenia was decidedly the victor. At this point, Russia, which you'll remember is technically an Armenian ally, stepped in to negotiate a ceasefire. The Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh were allowed to stay there, even though the land technically still belonged to Azerbaijan, and things were quiet for a little while. But as we've seen before, a ceasefire isn't the same thing as a peace. The Azeris laid low for a bit, but while doing so, they worked on strengthening their military, and they spent billions of dollars to do so. Where did all of those billions come from? They came from the sea. Offshore in the Caspian Sea, there is quite a bit of oil. Azerbaijan, however, wasn't necessarily able to access it, process it, or ship it out, so for a while, it was a bit of a lost opportunity. However, once the USSR collapsed, Western nations and corporations started to move in. They built the oil and gas infrastructure required to not just extract and process the oil and gas, but they also built a system of pipelines known as the Southern Gas Corridor. Using the corridor, Azerbaijan was finally able to supply oil and gas to the EU while bypassing both Russia and Armenia, which hadn't been possible before. So now Azerbaijan had all this money which it funneled into its military. It also had the backing of Turkey and the Western nations, and they were ready to take their land back. Suddenly, those Armenians weren't as formidable as they once were. In 2020, Azerbaijan launched an offensive, capturing the key city of Shusha and forcing the Armenians to surrender. The Azeris were able to capture portions of the Nagorno-Karabakh territory, but not all of it. The Russians stepped in again to help negotiate a ceasefire. They installed 2,000 peacekeeping troops in the Armenian-held territory, but Turkey also sent troops to the Azeri conquests. But again, ceasefire is not a peace. Russian peacekeepers might sound strange to us here in the US, but just as the US is a major political power in the West, Russia often fills that role in Eastern Europe and Asia. As long as they were in Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan was less likely to try anything. But then, Russia invaded Ukraine. During a moment when the Russian army had been especially weakened by the Ukrainians, Azerbaijan tested the waters, attacking Nagorno-Karabakh and seeing what would happen. And not a whole lot happened. The Armenians, who didn't have as strong of a military, were blindsided by the attack, and their protectors had bigger problems to worry about. So last week, Azerbaijan made its big move, reclaiming the land that was technically theirs, at least in the eyes of international law, and forcing thousands of Armenians to flee. All right, we've covered a lot of ground, so let's recap a few things. The disputed territory is Nagorno-Karabakh, which, according to international law, isn't disputed at all and belongs to Azerbaijan. However, it's been occupied by a large Armenian population for centuries, so that Armenians see it as their ancestral land. The Azeris are allied with the EU, Israel, and Turkey, mainly because they supply oil to the Western world, and they have a large Shia Muslim population. The Armenians are Christians, and they're primarily allied with the Russians. But things are looking grim for the Armenians. They're losing ground in Nagorno-Karabakh, and they're surrounded by Turks and Azeris who have historically tried to kill them all. The Armenian military is small, and the population is small, especially compared to the Azeris. Azerbaijan is also getting weapons and drones from Turkey and Israel. The Armenians have one major ally, Russia, but Russia has its own problems to deal with, so the Armenians can't really rely on them for protection. Speaking of Russians, around 70,000 Russians have fled to Armenia since Russia invaded Ukraine. So, Russians now make up the largest ethnic minority in Armenia. In the future, the Russians living in Armenia could potentially gain a political foothold in the country. And so the Armenians are outmatched, and now they're fearing another attempt at erasure and ethnic cleansing. Since the Azeri offensive, Armenians have been fleeing the area, some burning their homes as they leave. Azerbaijan wants to see the remaining Armenians fully integrated into Azerbaijan, but they're not interested in the Armenians having any political or minority rights. The Armenians are concerned about safe passage out of the region, calling on the United Nations to monitor the situation and send humanitarian aid. Officially, Azerbaijan has not divulged any plans to ethnic cleanse anyone, not that they would, but while it's understandable for the Armenians to be distrustful of the Azeris also have really strong positive relations with the Western nations right now. It seems they wouldn't want to jeopardize or sully those relationships by committing genocide, especially since they get a lot of their money by supplying oil to those nations. As of recording this, over 28,000 Armenians have crossed the border into Armenia, and aid is said to be reaching those who need it. Protests are happening in the Armenian capital as they contest the Azeris' right to the land and fear for the safety and well-being of their loved ones in the enclave. As this all plays out, we'll have to see what becomes of the land once the Armenians lose their grip on it. Will this mean peace for this part of the world? It might, at least for a little while, but as we've seen time and time again, the story is never really over in this part of the world. Since biblical times, this land has been changing hands, so it would be silly to expect this to be the last time it happens. We'll also have to keep an eye out for what Turkey's next move is. They've been wanting to build a road through the lower part of Armenia to connect the Azeri exclave Nakhchivan to the mainland. This would give Turkey road access to the Caspian Sea. So far, the Armenians have not let that happen, so we'll see if the Turks are more successful in the future. There's also the potentially separatist Azeris living in Iran, who may one day decide they want to be a part of Azerbaijan instead of Iran. The Armenians will likely continue to see their neighbors close in on them, and without the Russians to defend them, they have few options. In fact, they'll probably have to keep a close eye on the growing Russian population within its own borders. So, like I said at the start, this all feels very cut and dry when given the general overview of the conflict, and maybe you still feel that way after having gotten this far in the podcast, and if you have, thank you so much. What I try not to do in situations like this is to paint one side as obviously bad and the other as obviously good. And while some countries really do obviously bad things sometimes that can and should be acknowledged, it's unfair to describe an entire population of people that way. People aren't their governments, and even for those who agree with the actions of their governments, well, what I've learned is that people are complicated. They have complicated reasons for behaving the way they do and for believing the things they believe. To be clear, I'm not trying to make excuses for terrible people. Some people really are just terrible. From an outsider's perspective, it's perhaps easy to paint the Armenians as occupiers or colonizers on Azeri land. But from their view, they have a historical tie to the land. Their ancestors lived there, so they feel like they should also be able to live there. You can decide for yourself whether or not you think that's a good enough reason for them to stay there. While an Armenian exclave in the middle of another country doesn't seem to make much sense to most people, it's not unheard of. And while it might be tempting to point the finger at Stalin as the guy who created this whole fiasco, the reality is that the land and its people have been informed and upturned by centuries of instability. Unfortunately, the quickest way forward for a lot of these conflicts and international disputes is for people to just move on from what happened in the past. But when the things that happened in the past were genocides and massacres and historical displacement, you can't reasonably ask people to just forgive and forget. Even if you could swing forgiveness, you still would have a lot of people living with traumatic memories of when their neighbors tried to kill them. I'd imagine that that's very difficult to live with. Guys, so that about wraps up this episode. Be sure to come back and join us on the next episode of the ModCon Pod. It would be so nice to have you back. In the meantime, we would love to hear from you. Reach out to the show at hello@modconpod.com with any suggestions or questions you might have for us. Also, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on YouTube and tell your friends about us. And of course, thank you all for listening and for making it this far. This was a doozy of a podcast episode, I'll admit. Anyway, I can't wait to see y'all next time. Cheers. Modern Context is a Rabble Babble production, produced by Brandon Morgan and recorded live in Houston, Texas. For Modern Context, I'm your writer and host, Yasmin Aliyah Khan.